Hi, everybody. This is Blaine DeSantis, and I welcome you to another edition of Books and Looks. Yes, it's our weekly voyage of discovery in the wonderful world of books, as we discuss books I've read and authors that I've interviewed. And today I'm very happy to have with us, her name is Madeline Martin, and she is the author of The Keeper of Hidden Books, which takes place in Warsaw, Poland, beginning in 1939. And this is all about what people did to keep library books, private book collections in circulation despite opposition from the Nazis. It's a wide-ranging topic. I think you're going to really, really enjoy this. And for those of you on YouTube, you're now seeing this, right? You can now watch us. You're watching me, and you'll watch the entire interview with myself and Madeline now on YouTube. So this is something we're excited about. You can join us on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, anywhere you find podcasts, and on now fully audio and visible on YouTube. So without any further ado, let's go right into my interview with Madeline Martin. All right, friends, as I promised, we have with us today Madeline Martin, who's got a wonderful new book out called The Keeper of Hidden Books. Wow, is this a great book? Welcome, Madeline.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I'll tell you what, I'm very, very happy that I think we met on something on History Through Fiction, a Zoom call or something like that they had, and you texted me and I texted you, and we ended up, and I'm so glad we did because I love this book and I love all you're doing, and so I can't wait to get into all of this. And, tell us a bit about yourself, because I think I read somewhere you grew up in Germany. And did you go to college there? What did you study? Tell us a little bit about that.
So I am an Army brat, and I spent about 12 years collectively in Germany. I only did one semester in Germany, and I did that through the military. The University of Maryland has a branch that they use for military members and their family. So I did one semester at the University of Maryland, and the rest of my education I did here in St. Augustine, Florida, at Flagler College. And I actually chose St. Augustine, Florida to go to school because I am a total history nerd, and St. Augustine is the oldest city in America. And so I actually didn't go to school. I think a lot of people are interested to learn this. I didn't go to school for journalism or history. I actually ended up graduating with a degree in business administration and minors in economics, political science, and accounting. Absolutely nothing to do with writing. And my day job for years, until about 3 years ago, was working as a business analyst doing SQL programming.
A day job with all the writing you do. We'll get into that in a minute. Oh my gosh, that's amazing. Now, were you an avid reader when you grew up? Did you have any favorite books or authors?
Oh, absolutely. I absolutely loved to read. And my favorite when I was a little girl was Laura Ingalls Wilder. I read all of the Little House in the Big Woods, that whole series, over and over and over again. In fact, it's funny because I always wanted so bad to be Mary, but I was so unequivocally Laura.
Well, a lot of authors who've come on have told us that is one of their most popular and favorite series to read, the Little House series. So, that I've never read one of them. But I did just start reading. I started reading Anne of Green Gables finally over a few months ago, and I really, isn't it? Oh yeah, I started watching the show on Netflix, and then I started reading the book, and I really enjoyed it so very, very much. And people don't realize they're like 8 or 9 on those that she wrote of that saga. That's really, really good. Well, now tell me, when did you decide you wanted to become a writer, and when a full-time writer? Because you said 3 years ago you still had a day job. Tell us all about that.
I think I've always wanted to write, but wanting to become an author felt such a pie in the sky kind of a career, like wanting to be a supermodel or an actress or something. And so which is why I ended up going to school for business administration. I mean, I'm a very pragmatic type of person, and I thought, oh gosh, there's no way I'll ever be able to be an author. But I actually really started actively writing after my first daughter was born. When I was on maternity leave, I just thought, okay, let's do this. And so I started writing, and I was first published in 2015. And that was with romance, because I had written romance, historical romance previously. And at that point, I was writing, probably like 6 to 8 books a year. While I was working this day job, I was actually a single mom for 3 years of that as well. And I decided one time that I was going to try and write this historical fiction book, but I really wanted to. It was something that I wanted to venture into. And, but I just didn't have the time, obviously, because it takes so much research. And I joked that I was a full-time mom, full-time business analyst, full-time author, because of kind of what I was doing. And in February 2020, I ended up getting laid off from my job where I'd been for 16 years. They just kind of ran out of work. And so I had talked to my husband about it, and we both decided, you know what, I've been writing so much, let's just try to give this full-time writing thing a chance. And so I thought, okay, this is fantastic. I can work on my historical fiction. I'm going to finally have the house to myself after over a decade of writing. This is going to be amazing. Well, this was February 2020. We all know what happened. A couple weeks later, the pandemic, and everybody was home. But I was still able to write this book. And that book was The Last Bookshop in London. And, with that book, I had really hoped that I could maybe hit the USA Today bestseller list with that book, because I was a USA Today bestseller, but it was because I had been in anthologies with other authors who were much bigger names than me. And I really wanted to hit the USA Today bestseller list in my own right. So my friend had called me that day, and she said, Madeline, you hit the USA Today bestseller list. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is just the coolest thing ever. So then later on that night, I was driving my daughter to dance, and my editor called, and I had him on speaker, and he said, I just want to let you know that you just hit. And I'm thinking, oh no, he's going to say the USA Today bestseller list. And my youngest, who has no filter, is going to say, oh, she knows, her friend already told her. But he said, you hit number 8 on the New York Times. And I mean, I just started crying, because at this point I'd written over 30 books. Hitting the New York Times wasn't anything that ever felt like it was going to be real for me. And to have that happen was just amazing. So then I went home, and I did laundry with a glass of wine, because mom life doesn't stop. So, and then I've been able to write full-time ever since.
Good. Well, we have some friends who are avid readers, and they love that book. And so,
oh, thank you.
I'm very, very happy that this could keep progressing, and then that's wonderful. And now you said history. Yeah, most kids, when you heard the word history, they go, yuck. Okay, what drew you to history?
I really think that it was living internationally for so long. My first stint that we lived in Germany, I wasn't even a year old, and we lived there until I was 5 years old. And then after that, in middle school, we went back. And then after that, we were back for one more stint when I was in college. And, it was just one of those things where, when you go and you get to see these actual historical sites, and the tour guides, I feel like they're so passionate when they tell these stories. And these stories, they just come alive in your head while you're listening. And I think that's what really made me fall in love with history so much, was just really being surrounded by it, and surrounded by people who had that passion for history.
Mm-hmm. Well, it shows. And, but you are prolific, as you talked about, and as I said. How many books have you written now?
I think it's just over 40 at this point.
And you're a young girl. You're young. I mean, it's not like you're Agatha Christie, and wow, you are extremely prolific. But now, and that's why you are so prolific. And that's why I want to talk to you a little bit about historical romance and historical fiction, because you had said you were writing historical romance. Now, what do you consider the difference between the two?
So with a historical romance, if you took the romantic relationship out of the story, the entire story would completely fall apart. if you take the romantic relationship out of a historical fiction, the entire story will remain intact. It's like just a little extra something in the book. You know what I mean? An extra plot thread.
Wow. Okay. It's funny because I get most of my books, either publicists send it to me or I get them through NetGalley. And when they get to that category, historical fiction, most of them look like historical romance books. And I'm really surprised at that because I see those covers, doesn't do anything for me as a reader, you know? But you've made the transition. Are you think you're going to stay with the fiction or are you going to go back to the romance?
Oh, I'm definitely staying with historical fiction. It's definitely a genre that I've always loved and that I definitely want to continue writing in. I am writing some historical romance occasionally as well. I started a 5-book Regency romance series back probably 2 years ago, and I only released the first book. So I've had readers asking me for that second book. So I'm actually going to be writing that this year.
Okay. Do you think that they're easier to write, the romance books, than the historical fiction?
They definitely require significantly less research. That's for certain.
Okay. I can understand that. Is there a time period also that they seem to be, or you set yours in as opposed to others? I mean, your historical fiction has been mostly in the 20th century. Do you find that the historical romance are set back in the 19th, 18th centuries?
So I jumped around in different historical time periods. So I've done medieval, I've done the 1700s, and I've also done the Regency era as well. And now I'm writing World War II. And actually, I just recently announced a book deal for my next historical fiction for 2025. Not the next one to come out, but the one after that. And that one's actually going to be set in the Victorian era, which I'm super excited about. Mm-hmm.
Young
I
Victoria,
just love history.
Young Victoria or old
older.
Victoria? Older. Okay.
Older.
The one we're familiar with, but people don't realize there was a young Queen Victoria out there. You know, not at all like the old lady. No, not at all. Wow. Well, thank you for that discussion on that. Yeah, very interesting. Now, tell me, what was your inspiration behind the Keeper of Hidden Books? How'd you get that?
So the original inspiration really was twofold. One part of it is my family comes from Poland on my dad's side, although now I know that because his family comes from Poznan and I was researching Warsaw, and that's kind of like saying my family's from North America and I'm researching Canada, but I'm in the United States. So, so that was part of it, was really wanting to connect a little bit more to my family's roots. And the other aspect of it is I've always been really fascinated by the Polish underground, the Polish resistance group. They were the most cohesive group in all of Poland during World War II. And especially when I found out about their efforts in trying to make sure that people had books during the Nazi occupation, that was something that really intrigued me, especially like when I was reading about the Warsaw Ghetto and how people would put their own personal library into suitcases to carry around, and how they had the secret library for children with little bookshelves that would turn around and go from a dollhouse into books. I mean, that was really incredible. Yeah.
Okay. All right. And if I'm not mistaken, some of the best fighter pilots for the RAF were the Polish who escaped. The Polish aviators were some of the best out there. So yeah, they put up quite a fight, and they were by themselves, and quite a shame what had happened there. Well, now tell us a little bit about the plot and the main characters. What's this all about, this Keeper of Hidden Books?
So the main character is named Sophia, and she it actually starts off with her when she's 17, and it's not a young adult. It starts off with her younger because it's leading up to the Warsaw Uprising, and most of the people that fought in the Warsaw Uprising were around the age of 22 and actually younger. But so basically, her and her friend, it starts with Poland before the Nazi occupation, on the cusp of war. And then the Nazis come in and they occupy Warsaw, and everything around Sophia, as she knows it, really begins to disintegrate. And it's difficult for her because she's always had freedom in her life, which, and if people, I don't know if they know the history of Poland, but there had been over 120 years where Russia had occupied Poland. And after the Treaty of Versailles was signed in 1918, they were given their independence. And they had just celebrated 20 years of independence when the Nazis came in and occupied Poland. And they didn't have their independence back again until 1990. They were under the Soviet influence. So really, Zofia and her friends were born in this pocket of freedom that had really not been experienced for centuries. And so it's basically her and her friend, and everything that they know is kind of deteriorating around them. And they're working for the Public Library of Warsaw. And this part was actually based on journals that I had found from Warsaw's public librarians detailing all of their efforts to save books and even keep the library operational after the Nazis had closed it down. So, and throughout, they even have a secret book club where they read a lot of little books that are being banned to talk about it. And yeah.
Well, I'll tell you what, you did a heck of a lot. We've written each other back and forth, and you've done a lot of research. Could you tell us a little bit about all the research you did to get to write this book?
Yes, it was definitely a lot of research. I used over 100 nonfiction books to come up with a lot of this material. A lot of that included firsthand accounts. And even that part was interesting because of the fact that the Soviets really were in control of Poland for so long. If a book was published in Poland prior to 1990 and translated into English, I couldn't use it because of censorship issues. I had to, every time I would get a new nonfiction book, I had to see where it was originally published to make sure that I could actually use that information that was inside. And so I had that. And I also ended up going to Warsaw for 2 weeks. My mom came with me, and I had this amazing tour guide who was able to assemble several days. These tours went from 8 hours to 16 hours. And she just gave me so much incredible information. So by the time I started writing this book, I had over 15 spiral-bound notebooks that were completely filled with handwritten notes based off of all of the research that I had done. And, it's interesting. I think I only use about 30% of it in the actual book, but the rest of that 70% really helps make everything come to life for me so I could write it.
I remember one time I was in Italy and our tour guide said, now you'll remember less than 10% of what I told you. I don't think that was your case. I think you got everything. I'll tell you, what a wonderful,
I did.
what a wonderfully researched book. I'm going to tell you, this was great.
Thank
now,
you.
One of the things that I found fascinating, and I got a book over here in my library called Poland 1939 about the invasion and everything else. But what I found fascinating is that the people of Warsaw thought they were going to be able to hold off the Germans. That while the rest of Poland may be collapsing, Warsaw was convinced they were going to be the bastion and turn the tide back. It didn't happen, huh? Is this true? They were really that like this?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you would liken it almost to like New York City, would we really think that Russians would be able to invade New York City and take it? And that really was kind of how Warsaw was. I mean, Warsaw was considered, like another Paris. And they never thought that it was even possible that the Germans would come in and take their city.
Yeah. Wow. And they did. And eventually they could starve them out. I mean, that's the other thing. They cut the supply lines in. We saw that happen in many other places. And once you don't have food, it's a whole different ballgame there, isn't it? Wow. I'll tell you. Wow, that was really something. That was one of the things I found interesting. Now, we find that Sophia and her friend Janina, am I pronouncing that correct? Janina? They were...
I've been saying Janina, but I don't think it really...
Okay,
Janina, I might be saying it wrong also.
They were assigned to the Warsaw Public Library. Okay, they were eventually what was their job in the library? And in the sequence of, was this before or after the Germans had taken over Warsaw?
This was after, and their original goal was really to kind of um, help out around the library while they were taking classes. They actually used to offer classes in the Warsaw Public Library, taught by librarians for people to learn how to become librarians. So while they were taking those classes, they were helping out wherever they could, organizing certain books, reshelving things, doing returns, helping out with patrons as needed, pretty much everything.
Okay. And it was open during the shelling and everything this whole time then, even after the occupation, the public library was open?
Correct. During the bombing and everything, the library stayed open. The main branch of the Warsaw Public Library, there were dozens of lending libraries throughout the city, and a lot of those had closed. In fact, a lot of those were irreparably damaged, but the main library stayed open. After the Nazi occupation, the library opened and closed and opened and closed. They were constantly closing it. They were constantly firing and furloughing employees, and then they were hiring them back again and reopening it until finally, I believe it was August 1942, the doors were completely shut forever, or at least forever as far as the Nazi occupation goes. So at that point, that's when they had a secret library that they opened up and they started running to ensure that people could still get books.
Okay. Also, I found it interesting that if it was a book written by a Polish individual, or maybe even Belgium or French or whatever, they got the Germans made them get rid of those books, but they kept the English books. That's interesting that they kept English.
Certain ones, not all of them. They were very particular about which ones they kept.
Okay. Well, then these girls, we're jumping all around here in this thing here, but the flow of the conversation takes us there. This thing they called the Bandit Book Club, that started out as something called, the Anti-Hitler Book Club, if I'm not mistaken?
Yeah, right.
Okay, and then it becomes the Bandit Book Club. Was there such a book club that you were able to find in your research? And tell us a bit about the Bandit Book Club.
It wasn't something that came from my research specifically, but I did. So my thought process with putting this together is I wanted Sophia's character to be feisty and rebellious. And with all of my books, I usually have a reader somewhere in the book because for me, reading is such a ubiquitous part of my life. I can't help but not include it in my own stories. And so, when I was thinking, okay, I have this rebellious teenager who loves to read, and Hitler's pretty much, on the cusp of war with them. What would she do? And I thought, I think that she would want to read these books that Hitler's banning. And I think we can all agree that there's no better way to enjoy a book than when you get to read it and discuss it with friends. And so that's where the idea for the Anti-Hitler Book Club came in. And so, but putting it together was really, really, really difficult just because of the work involved. I had to make sure that the books had actually been banned, which that was the easiest part because unfortunately there were so many books that were banned. I had to make sure that the books had been translated into Polish. I had to read all of the books, and it's funny because everyone talks about War and Peace being so long, but Les Miserables was even longer. But I have to say, it was such a beautifully written book. I have never had the opportunity to read it, and I'm so glad I did. But one of the other major parts of it too is I wanted each one of these books to really reveal something to the characters, a different point of view or perspective that they wouldn't have had if they hadn't read these books. So each of these books has a poignant place in this story. And that really was a labor of love.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It was interesting. And as the years went on, the books got longer and they were down to only a single copy they could pass around to each other. And does this coincide with the closing of the library in 1942?
It's with the closing of the library. It's also with the destruction of books. It's also with the books that people would borrow and not bring back, books that were slowly destroyed over time because so many people were reading these individual copies. It was just getting harder and harder to have availability and access to those books that were being banned.
Mm-hmm. Now, you talked about at times that they were given lists of books they had to get rid of, but then they were able to move and keep some in the back. Is that true, that they were able to hide some books in a back storage area or warehouse of the library?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
The warehouses for the library in the main library building were enormous. So they actually would hide books they would misshelve them intentionally to keep them from being found. And then in the very beginning, they would even take them out of the card catalog, but still leave them on the shelves up on the main floor. As time went on and it got a little bit riskier to do that, they started relocating them into the actual warehouse. But then they also ended up having a secret warehouse as well, where they were keeping them eventually.
They were all over trying to hide books, weren't they?
They were, absolutely. I mean, it's easy. I think it's like with us and our culture now, and having printing readily available to us in the way that we do, you think about, oh, well, who cares if a few thousand books get destroyed? But, back then, especially with the paper shortage, especially with the war on, some of these books could have been gone forever. In fact, a lot of books were. A lot of these older books, maybe something that was from the 1500s that was handwritten. If that book was destroyed, everything in that book is gone forever. It can never be replicated. So, it really was very important for them to try to keep as many of these books as possible, especially the older ones. But even the ones that were being banned, I mean, they didn't know if all of the Polish versions were going to be gone forever. But they also wanted to keep them so that once the war was over, once the occupation was over, they could be able to give them to people again.
Right. One of my first interviews was with a librarian emeritus from out in California and named Peter Briscoe. And he said that one of the worst things that's happening is the digitalization of all the books. And he says, all the books you have are sitting here on a computer and no one knows how to find them, read them, discover them, because nobody browses anymore. And that's so true. Yeah, we have a very fine library here in Greenville, I think 13, 14 branches, and I don't go there and just look through the shelves anymore. And it's a shame what's happening.
Yeah, no, I completely agree.
Yeah, and so they were keeping everything there for eventual times that they were hoping would happen. They would get their freedom back and could distribute it. Now, they also, and again, this is the other thing which you mentioned earlier, and I found fascinating, they were able to have a library in the Jewish ghetto. How did that work? And why wasn't it discovered?
Well, initially, it was put up like it was basically a care for orphans. And so they didn't know, the Nazis didn't know that it was a library. It was very much done in secret, and because it was for the children. So eventually libraries actually were allowed in the ghetto for a short period of time, but for a while this one did operate in secret.
I was completely unaware of that. That's amazing. And you mentioned here that that the Nazis were trying to dismantle the culture of Poland, and it wasn't just in books, was it? Everything.
Oh no, it was everything. Yeah, I mean, their original intent for Poland was they wanted to, kill off or imprison 85% of the population. They wanted to keep the remaining 15% to be used as slave labor. And so they attacked everything from the music to like the food, like the culture, even to Catholicism, which was really, really huge in Poland, because they wanted to completely demoralize and strip away everything that made the Polish people Polish, so that they would be, biddable slaves, basically, to serve them.
Why was that? Why was it with Poland and not with Belgium or not with France or Luxembourg or whatever? Why was it Poland, do you think?
They looked at people who were Polish as being subhuman.
And the Russians, and again later in the book we do get to the Russians here. They were no big friends of the Poles either. The Poles thought they were going to be a savior, but they really weren't.
Well, the Poles had a very complicated past with the Russians because they had been previously occupied by Russia. And then, after World War I, they were the Soviet Union. And so basically, Poland knew that it wasn't going to be strong enough to defeat the Nazis. And so they looked to the Soviet Union to be able to help kind of get them out and hopefully be able to award them back their freedom. Obviously, that ended up not working out. They pretty much just once they were on the other side of the Vistula River, the Soviet Union pretty much just let the Nazis and the Polish Home Army pretty much just destroy themselves because they ultimately wanted Warsaw and Poland for themselves.
Aye. Now, a lot of people, as we move on in our life and our history and our day-to-day living, a lot of people don't know about the Jewish ghetto uprising or revolt that went on. You got into that very well, I thought. Could you tell us a little bit about that uprising? How long did it last?
Well, there actually were two uprisings in the Warsaw Ghetto. The first one, and both of them really were spurred by roundups, by all the roundups that were happening. And the first one happened was just pretty much like a day, but it was successful enough to be able to drive the Nazis back and keep the people who were supposed to be rounded up from being rounded up. And I think that for them, that was a really huge win. And it gave them the motivation to realize, oh my gosh, maybe we can do this for longer. So they started to put together, like at night when everything went quiet, you could hear the sound of building happening. And that was basements that were being converted into bunkers. That was people putting together homemade arms. They were doing flamethrowers, grenades, Molotovs, pistols, whatever they could get their hands on to create weapons to defend themselves. Now, the Jewish people in the ghetto knew that it was impossible for them to win this, but they basically wanted to at least die fighting. And so the eventual ghetto uprising did finally happen. The Polish Home Army did try to help as well. However, unfortunately, anti-Semitism was rife, especially with all of the Nazi propaganda going on. And Poland, unfortunately, suffered from anti-Semitism even before the Nazi occupation. And so they didn't have the full support of the Home Army, but some people did actually try to help, but their efforts were futile. And so the uprising itself, I can't remember. I apologize if this, all the smaller details are easy to slip away. This is also, I did the research 3 years ago for this. But I want to say it went on for about a month. But it was very sad. I mean, of course, they ended up being defeated, and then the entire ghetto was completely razed.
Yeah, and that was interesting. They put them in, but then they rounded them up. They put them in the ghetto, and then they cramped more people in, and more people, and then they started shrinking the size of the ghetto. Even I was unaware that they shrank the boundaries of the ghetto to almost starve them out. Well, I don't know. It was a terrible situation. Anyway, now our girl Sophia, she joins something called what were they called? The
Grey Ranks.
The Gray, yes, huh? Now, there's not many funny parts in this book, okay? Let's be honest. This is a very well-written book, and there's not a lot of humor during these time periods. But, Madeline, let's talk a little bit about fleas and itching powder. That cracked me up. That's the funny part. What was that all? Did that really happen? Tell us about that.
It actually did. So the Grey Ranks basically were the Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts that once the Nazi occupation happened, they ended up becoming kind of like a little subterfuge group, and different age groups did different things. So the older kids were the ones that were more responsible for blowing up train tracks and the more dangerous jobs. But the younger kids still really had a role to play as well. And a lot of times they were the pranksters that were just kind of a thorn in the Nazi side. So they would do things like they would steal Nazi flags. They would take light bulbs that were full of paint and throw it at vehicles and throw it through windows. But also they would do things like releasing fleas in the cinema or putting itching powder in underwear of Nazis that had been freshly laundered.
Oh my! Yeah, that again. That's levity there. I'll tell you, that was something. Now I switched to go back to one of the other more disturbing scenes when you have Sophia and Janina walking together in the rain, and they go underneath an awning, and they are accosted by a drunken German soldier. Could you tell us a little bit about that? Because I think the people would like to hear what that was all about.
Right. That actually was probably, for me, one of the more powerful scenes that I had written. And so basically, Janina and Sophia are walking. It's raining. They kind of go underneath an awning to get out of the rain. And a Nazi soldier comes around the corner. He's drunk, and he's thinking that they're coming out of the cafe. At that point in time, Jews were no longer allowed to go into cafes. And so he basically starts, verbally accosting Janina. And at this point, Sophia has been so angered by the unfairness of how people who are Jewish are being treated. And so she finally lets loose her rage, and she stands up for her friend, and she tells this Nazi off. And she thinks that if anything, she's the one who's going to be punished. But then he turns his gun on Janina, and he threatens Janina's life because of the way that Sophia had stood up for her. And that was such an important moment because while she's doing this, she's thinking, other people are going to hear me say this. Other people are going to stand up behind me. This is our chance to really stand up and speak against what's happening. And as she's speaking to him and as he's pointing this gun at Janina, the people around them just walk by and pretend like nothing's happening. And it's such a powerful moment, I think, because so many people say, how could the Holocaust happen? How could the persecution happen? How does this even begin? And it begins like this. It begins with nobody wanting to involve themselves, everybody being too afraid. It involves people who are strong and trying to stand up for others, and the people who aren't strong enough to speak up for themselves, the ones who are being persecuted and attacked. And it was such a complete scene of utter impotence. And that's why I think that scene was so important to show.
Reading it was difficult also. Now, one of the things interesting was that fear and greed had taken over also. And we see that with an elderly neighbor who eventually wanted to turn the family in. We also see this with others who were supposed to be safe houses. Tell us a bit about what happened during this time period.
Well, first of all, everybody was absolutely terrified. If somebody was hiding somebody who is Jewish in their home and they were found out about it, the entire apartment would be either killed or arrested. So even if they didn't know anything about it, I mean, this was an incredibly, whereas the way, like when the Nazis were in France, for example, they treated everybody with like they had white gloves on, that was not the case in Poland because they essentially wanted to kill and arrest everybody for the most part. So they really were very, very brutal in their treatment of the Poles, and obviously incredibly brutal with their treatment of the Jews. And so it was definitely a time of fear. And so when people did manage to escape the ghetto and they were hiding on the Polish side, they usually would only be able to hide for like 2 or 3 weeks before eventually being found out, before the people decided to get too scared and they didn't want to hide them anymore. Of course, at this point in time, Jews were completely being exploited in so many different ways for money and other kind of favors, to even just be able to afford to be able to be hidden. So it was a very, very scary, treacherous time. And unfortunately, a lot of people did capitalize financially and in other ways as well, trying to hide people really as profit.
She saved Sophia saved the one lady's granddaughter, and in the end, that same lady wants to turn her into the Germans for hiding a Jewish family, and it's like, wow,
Well, and that particular one wasn't necessarily greed based. That was very much fear based.
That was fear.
Yeah.
No doubt about that. No doubt about that. Well, that's really that was very fascinating, that situation. And now we see very few male characters in your book. Very few. They may be there, but they're not main characters. But we had one gentleman who I think makes it into this book. You tell us a little bit about him?
Right. Well, and really quick to kind of mention why there aren't more male characters. You'll have to remember a lot of the male characters would have gone off to fight. So oftentimes with World War II, you're not going to often have a lot of male characters unless you're actually showing battle scenes, because most of the men that were able-bodied were off fighting. And so that is one of the cases with this particular book as well. But so Derek is, he really is kind of like the love interest, I guess I could say, for Sophia, although she wants absolutely nothing to do with him in the very beginning, because in her mind, with everything that's going on, how can anybody even possibly think about love? I mean, people are being persecuted, they're suffering. There's so much to be angry about. How can somebody possibly want love and a relationship? But he is a very good person. He's this like amazing artist, and eventually he starts to sort of chip away at her stony exterior.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a nice little relationship that develops there and everything. And he even helped her. I think he even found, he brought her down to an underground concert, if I'm not mistaken, at one point, a piano concert. Yeah, I liked that a lot. Yeah, that was really good. Wow. Tell me, you lived in Germany. You write about the Polish situation. How long do you think it's going to take, or is there have the two countries and their people, have they mended the scars of the war, or do you think they're still ongoing?
Oh, I think so. I mean, I think, of course, it depends on how closely personal somebody has had, something that happened. But I will say it was interesting because when I went to Warsaw for my research, that's when the war with Ukraine had just really started. I mean, Russia had just attacked Ukraine maybe like 6 months before. And a lot of people don't know this, but there was a very like sort of bloody, tumultuous past between Ukraine and Poland. And so I was talking to my tour guide, and I happened to mention it. And I said, it's amazing that when Ukraine needed you, like when Ukraine needed assistance, Poland completely just opened the border and welcomed the Ukrainians in and absorbed them and has been helping them through everything. And I said, even with this past, that really was not so distant. And she shrugged and she said, it's the history. It's just history. They need help, and we're here to help them. So for me, I didn't specifically speak to anybody about the Polish relationship with Germany, but I will say that obviously they all talk about World War II, and they talk about, I think they focus more on the incredibly brave people and the incredible feats that people who are Polish accomplished in the face of such adversity, more than they talk about hatred for Germany.
Okay, interesting. Hey, by the way, throwaway line. It wasn't a throwaway line, but people will read it as such. This is the detail, friends. This is the detail I'm telling you about. Tell us a little about Ego Sim, S-Y-M. Who is Ego Sim, and why is he important in this book? And 2 lines, that's all we have about him. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so Ego Sim was he was a very famous actor on the stage, and he was also a famous Nazi collaborator. He was one of the people who was tried. And so when I was kind of talking about how the Polish resistance group and the Polish underground was incredibly unified, and very effective. This is one prime example. So they had underground court systems where they would try Nazis that were especially cruel and collaborators who were especially cruel in absentia. And if they were found guilty, then they basically were slated for execution. And so Ego Sims was one of these people who was a horrible person. He was a horrible Nazi collaborator. And so he was found guilty. And kind of also going back when I was talking about the gray ranks and how some of the older kids had more dangerous jobs within the gray ranks, the older scouts who were with the gray ranks were oftentimes charged with the execution. But he was probably, I think, the first person who was actually executed by the gray ranks acting on behalf of that underground court system that had found him guilty.
Interesting. You know, if you're in France today, I'm told you shouldn't use the word collaborator. That still is a bad word to use. Yeah,
I've got thoughts on that.
Another author told me that. He said, I used it one time. I was told, don't you ever use that word in France. Wow, that's interesting. Well, now, I could talk to you another hour, but I can't because there are limits and you got to get going. And but before we go, what's next for Madeline Martin? What do you got coming up for us? I know there's some things coming, so let's hear all about it, okay?
All right. So thank you for asking. My next book is called The Book Lover's Library. That one comes out September 10th, 2024, and it's set in Nottingham, England. And for people who love The Last Bookshop in London, this really is kind of going back. There's heartwarming home front vibes. In fact, there actually might be a cameo from The Last Bookshop in London as well. But it's basically about a widowed mother whose daughter has to be sent away during the evacuation. And she also, the woman, Emma, she starts working at this lending library called the Book Lovers Library with a lot of quirky people, quirky patrons, and kind of a rediscovery of a love of reading.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then you just told me this morning you already almost done with another book. Is that correct?
Yeah. So actually, I've already written, the next book that's coming out in 2025 is a Victorian set historical fiction. And it's called The Secret Book Society. And it's about a countess who's been widowed 3 times, and she starts seeing these other women who are having their reading materials repressed because it was seen as evil for women to read a lot of these books. Like they were taking their time away from husbands and kids, and they were too sensitive to be reading a lot of these novels. And so she opens up her personal library and the Secret Book Society.
I'm going to tell you what, friends, we've had a wonderful chat today with Madeline Martin. I hope you've enjoyed as much as I've had. Madeline, thank you so much for coming and joining us today on Books and Looks.
Thank you. It's been absolutely my pleasure.
All right, friends, we'll be right back. Well, I hope you enjoyed that interview with Madeline Martin as much as I did. I had a wonderful time chatting with her and we learned so much about what they did over in Poland to keep the libraries and to keep the culture of books alive. And it's what we're doing here on Books and Looks. We're keeping this stuff alive. We're talking about all sorts of books with all the authors. I hope you'll join us. Hey, tell us what you think about now being able to see us on YouTube. Big change, I know. I'm a little nebulous about this, but, let's say we got to keep changing all the time for you. Anyway, on behalf of viewsonbooks.com, on behalf of my good friends at Podcast Studio X, this is Blaine DeSantis for Books and Looks saying, may all your leaves be pages in a book.